Several times over these last weeks, the question's been asked, when we're no longer the pencil with which God writes, as said by Mother Teresa, and we're no longer the hole in the flute through which God plays, as the great poet Hafiz has said, then what are we? And there's a very confronting but profound Zen story. It's a story told in the land of the rising sun, at a time when Buddhism was burgeoning, evidenced by the great number of Zen temples that they were abounding around the countryside, and at a time when the relationship between the state and religion was not just close, but working closely together. And there was at that time a monk called Zoga. Now, this was not his real name, because in actuality Zoga came from a very illustrious Japanese family. His father was a member of the imperial court, and it was expected that he too would rise to a similar position. So he was a young man of great prospects. But when Zoga entered the monastery, he showed a behavior that was different from all the behavior of all the others. In fact, he was called mad. He was just not impolite and disrespectful. He was really quite uncouth. He didn't take care of his personal being. He didn't do zazen when all the other monks sat in the meditation hall. He went out on his own with his own begging bowl. And he didn't show up when the master called for him to have personal discussions with him, which is the way one would normally progress along the spiritual path. And of course there was a lot of ill feeling from the other monks so far as Zoga was concerned. And so they took great delight in reporting to the abbot that not only did Zoga have all these other behaviors, but he actually prayed. Buddhists don't pray. They chant the sutras and light incense and do all of those things, but pray. But Zoga was heard to pray. So the other monks took delight in going to the abbot and telling them that they could distinctly hear Zoga praying, and he was saying under his breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear, either possess me or leave me. So as it happened, every year in the monastery, in the temple, they had a great festival where monks, illustrious monks, were invited from other temples to have a debate, and then they had a great feast. And after this feast, it was the custom that the monks would stand and they would throw the leftovers of the food to all those in need. And many people would come to seek these alms. And on an occasion, the monks had finished their debates, very elevated discussions that went on. They enjoyed the great feast that had taken place, and they were all out on the balcony throwing food over to those needy, destitute people who all came milling around, fighting to get the titbits. when, to their very great surprise, when they looked down, there was Zoga amongst the lot of them, fighting for the bits of food that were being thrown over the balcony. Well, he was called in to the abbot's chambers, and the abbot was quite incensed and angry, because what an example for this, and even wearing his dirty monk's robes, he was still a monk after all. So he was hauled up in front of the abbot, and the abbot said, "You're completely mad." And Zoga said, "It's not me who's mad, it's you." So of course the abbot was quite incensed, and the abbot said, "Well, you're disgraceful." Well, to say disgraceful was really something very terrible. And it was debated afterwards whether Zoga actually did it on purpose, because after being called disgraceful, he couldn't do anything else but leave the temple, leave the monastery. And really, people debated that this is what he really wanted to do anyway. So off Zoga went, and he went up to find himself a little cave in the mountains. And really nobody thought about him for some while. But there's a saying about people who shun society. The society really can't forget them. And there was starting to be a whisper around that he was some kind of saint. And so people started to come. They beat a path up to his cave. Well, he treated them so badly, he swore at them, and he spat at them, and he got his staff, but of course that just served to make him even more illustrious in the eyes of the people that came. So it didn't work. But you know how these things go. As it happened, there was a very, very wealthy man who wanted to give largesse to a temple. But he wanted to choose a temple that was worthy of being given this substantial amount of money. So he was going from temple to see who was worthy enough. Well, of course, what could be more worthy than having a disreputable saintly like a monk amongst your midst? So an invitation was sent to Zoga to come down to the temple when the wealthy man was visiting. And so he decided that he would go. He said, one doesn't know what he thought, but we can maybe get into his mind later on. We'll see. But anyways, Zoga decided that he would go down to the temple when the wealthy man was there. Well, when he got down there, he was totally disrespectful to the wealthy man. You know, he was quite abusive, and he didn't go through the usual salutations and greetings and so forth. But you know, this went down well with the wealthy man. He thought, well, this is how saints act. You know, he must be very saintly. But then Zoga started to deride his trappings of his wealth. You know, that big house that you're living in, I'm sure the wealth that you got was by some untoward means and so. Well, the wealthy man got very angry about this when Zoga was talking about his personal possessions and his family. So he got quite affronted, and he decided that he wouldn't give his money to this temple after all. He gave it to another temple. Well, of course, the members of his temple were very disappointed and blamed Zoga, so they left him alone. He went back up to the mountains and resumed his way of life. But you know how people are. They beat a path to his door, and even though he moved from place to place, they followed him, and even when he abused them, they kind of thought how saintly he was. And this came to the ears of the Empress herself. Well, of course, she had to meet someone who was said to be such a saint. So she sent an entourage with a great palanquins and so forth to invite Zoga down to her palace. So he decided that he would indeed go. So he was taken with great pomp and ceremony into the presence of. He was given a chamber which he immediately trashed, and when they bought sweetmeats for him to eat, he'd put them all over the walls and all over the floors and so forth. And then when he came into the presence of the empress, he farted and he burped and he looked for lice under the hairs of his arms and caught them and killed them. And, the empress was really quite impressed with this behavior, reporting it to be really what a saint would do. And, her chambermaids tittered and also. And then Zoga caught sight of a big beautiful enamel bowl that was sitting over on a stand over there, and he said, oh, so this is your piss pot, is it? And then he said, oh, well, I'm sure you have trouble getting your substantial bottom over that to bring out a few little drops of yellow fluid that obviously indicate that you've got some venereal disease, because it's well known that you had so many lovers when you were youthful, and now you invite monks because nobody else will go with you. Well, the chambermaids were all waiting for the empress to titter about this too, but she was totally affronted, of course. Got on her dignities and marched out of the... So Zoga thought to himself, well, let's put paid to that, they won't bother me again. So back he goes to the mountain, and the people still came, and he'd still move from place to place, trying to keep them away, using his staff and swearing and spitting and doing those things that he did. But time passed, and it so happened that his old master, his abbot, was to be given ordination into an extraordinarily illustrious position in the Buddhist hierarchy. And at that time, of course, it was the custom that all of his students would be invited to come down and participate in the ceremonies. Now, by this time, Zoga was one of the oldest students of this great abbot. So he was invited down to the ceremony. Well, instead of riding a horse, he came riding a cow. And instead of having a sword in his belt, he had a dried fish. And so when he came down and all of this great horde of people were there, pomp and ceremony that really rivaled what an emperor would do, Zoga came riding up on his cow with his dried fish, and he waved at people out of the way. I'm the oldest student here. I should be in charge of this and stand by the right side of my master. Well, of course, the old abbot was standing up there with his robes on, waiting for his ordination, and he had to witness this scene of Zoga with his dried fish beating people out of the way while he came to take his position beside him. And the old abbot had an inkling. He realized what Zoga was on about, but he consoled himself with the recognition that there were many ways, and that it was all right for him. So, of course, the ceremonies were completed. But after that, people really did leave Zoga alone. He went back to his mountain retreat, and for the most part was left in peace, until it came to the moment of his parting this life. And we know very well the way of such things. Because the toothless old monks who were left in the monastery, several of whom who had been his companions in the days of his youth, somehow knew that he was about to die. And they made their way up to his mountain retreat. And there was Zoga, wearing the same filthy shift that he'd worn for so many years, dancing around like a child in celebration. And then he lay down and he left these realms. The monks who were there gave him a suitable burial with the rituals of their faith. And then they departed. You know, there was much debate about the life of Zoga, because in the course of his life, it was evident that he shunned wealth. He shunned even the religion and the pomps and ceremonies and so forth of life. But when it came to the question of what it was when he said, "Either possess me or leave me," there's still debate going on about this. So relative to our question, what is it? What are we when we're no longer the pencil or the whole? Does this story give us any indications? What rises up for you out of this provocative tale? Either possess me or leave me. What could he be meaning with those words? How many times in your lifetime have you said, "Beam me up, Scotty. I've had enough of this. Get me out of here. Get me off the treadmill. Get me out of this arena." Combative. And it said at the end of this story that in this position, if there's something above us, we become its slave. We have to kowtow to it, like society and its mores. And if there are things below us, we have to have compassion for those that are beneath us. And so we're caught. We're enslaved, whichever way we look. So what do these words mean? Possess me or leave me? Life. So again, it brings us back to the same question. What's our relationship with life now? Are you still a slave? Caught betwixt and between?
Sounds like a saying that we have called saying is being comfortable, being uncomfortable.
All right.
Sounds like he was wanting to move on from something and either possess him and go to its full extent or go.
Yes.
He was. Sounds like he was actually trying to sort that out within himself.
Right.
And whatever it was.
Yes.
Yeah, whether it be a feeling or a vice or whatever it was.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Because there's also the saying, when you've had enough, you'll give up.
Uh-huh.
You'll stop doing it.
You stop doing it. It's food for thought relative to these questions that remain unanswered. Thank you.